This presentation, titled The Challenges and Benefits of Environmental Auditing Using Remote Methods, comes to us from Nigel Lehane. Nigel has 30 years of experience in environmental management consulting, working with clients in a range of sectors and focusing on their environmental and sustainability performance. He specializes in working to improve clients' management systems, standalone or integrated, addressing environment, health and safety, energy, and quality. He has extensive experience in auditing globally, in management systems, compliance, and due diligence. Nigel chairs the ISO subcommittee for environmental auditing, TC207 SC2, and its UK equivalent. He has represented the UK on various ISO working groups for a number of years, including on the development of ISO 14001:2015 for environmental management systems, ISO 19011:2018 for the auditing of management systems, and ISO 45001:2018, the OHS management system standard. He is currently participating in the development of ISO 14016 for the assurance of environmental sustainability reports. And with that, take it away, Nigel.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to have this opportunity to talk to you about remote auditing, or auditing using remote methods. Thanks for the introduction. I'll skip over this slide because I think that's already been covered. So why explore remote auditing now? Well, it's very topical, isn't it? The current COVID crisis is preventing access to sites and to organizations, especially for external auditors, but also within large organizations. There may be travel and other restrictions in place. Certification or registration bodies have been keen to transition to remote methods, especially for surveillance audits, so that they can continue to maintain certification for their clients. However, from discussions with auditors, it's becoming clear that many see some advantages in utilizing remote methods more frequently in the future, not just as a tool to combat the current crisis. So now is an opportune time to consider these issues. So I'm going to look at a range of topics which include an overview of remote auditing, remote methods and the environmental auditing process, how we use remote methods within the overall scheme of things. I'll focus on some of the challenges using remote methods and review how we can incorporate remote methods within a broader environmental audit program. And then finally, I want to touch on some of the benefits of remote auditing. So I think that is a really important aspect that we shouldn't overlook. So firstly, remote auditing methods. Let's review what we do in a traditional audit. So we undertake a range of different types of activity. All of them are for collecting evidence. So we carry out document review in various ways. That can be when you're on site, going through documentation, maybe in hard copy, maybe looking at the environmental manager's screen, etc., and going through a whole range of different forms of information. Or potentially it could be remote, accessing some database or a data room, conceivably. We could be gathering evidence from observation as auditors, walking around a site, a facility of some sort, maybe an introductory site tour, or having a physical inspection of key areas of the operation. And we could be carrying out interviews, or we probably will be carrying out interviews as part of the audit process. They may be face-to-face, maybe on the factory floor, maybe in offices with senior management, etc. Formal audit meetings, so many different forms that they may take. And again, in traditional auditing, we do sometimes use remote methods. We may have parts of an audit which we carry out remotely by video conferencing or call or whatever to talk to people who perhaps can't be on site at the time that we're there. So we're not doing something that is totally new. We're going to be using, hopefully, methods that are to some degree familiar, but in remote auditing, we'll be relying far more on communications technology of various kinds. So this slide is taken from ISO 19011, which is the standard that provides guidelines for management systems auditing. I think it's quite useful in the context of remote auditing because this illustrates the different types of methods that we can use. And as you can see from the matrix on the left-hand side, it's categorized by whether there's any human interaction or not, and across the top, whether the auditor is actually on site or working remotely. So obviously the on-site scenario is very much familiar and traditional to us. The remote part of this matrix is quite interesting. Again, it explains various methods that are, many of them, common. We use them in all sorts of different work activities for meetings, webinars, or whatever outside of audits themselves, but also we very much can use them. So 19011 recognizes that remote audits can be undertaken for interviews, for observing work, and it mentions here with a remote guide. So somebody on site moving around with a camera, allowing us to see what's actually going on. It refers to potentially completing checklists and questionnaires and conducting document review with auditee participation. So this may be where you're in some form of remote meeting, Zoom meeting, Team, or whatever application, and you may be sharing documentation there and discussing it with the auditee. And then for no human interaction, where the auditor is entirely remote and could be reviewing documentation in a data room, etc., using some form of data retention system. Possibly also observing work that's being performed, and it mentions here perhaps by surveillance camera. So you don't then necessarily have, or it's unlikely you have the opportunity to direct the camera to where you're interested in. You'd be simply looking at perhaps an overview of a site rather than looking at specific areas. And we may carry out analysis of data remotely. So very much traditional recognized approaches to using remote audit methods. They take various forms, all sorts of forms nowadays. This is something that I find increasingly fascinating, having carried out remote audits over many years in various ways, and experiencing a whole range of problems with them in the early days when our communications technology wasn't so reliable. But obviously now it's far easier for us to do an awful lot more remotely. So for documentation review, we can use simple things like email or other electronic means of exchange of documents. It could be photos or scans of hard records that are sent. We may have remote access to information systems. Potentially the auditor's given a login to the company's management system or data system, usually with some very stringent confidentiality requirements attached to that, obviously. Screen sharing with the auditee during an online meeting, which can be quite effective. And potentially things like using the remote camera during a site tour to actually focus in on documentation that you may come across actually during the audit. Although that may not be very effective, the resolution may not be great, etc. And it may be hard to scroll through a long hard copy document that way. In interviews, we can use audio, obviously, phones, or one of the many forms of audio-visual communications that are available and are increasingly popular, common, and effective. And we can use those methods just as a two-way conversation or involving multiple parties, so holding virtual meetings, which again can be very helpful for the audit scenario, maybe allowing us to host opening and closing meetings as well as carrying out interviews with individual auditees. And there's a huge range of different applications from social media to commercial applications and bespoke communication systems that we can use for that. I think something that we need to be sure of is that both the auditor and the auditee are familiar with these communication systems so that we can use them effectively. And then carrying out observations. This might be the most challenging area of remote auditing. But again, it does open up a lot of opportunities. We can use dedicated mobile portable cameras and mobile phones even, using common social media applications to share video and potentially also still image. But certainly video is preferable. It allows us to give to gain a good appreciation of what's going on a site. Not just having an overview, but potentially focusing in on very specific areas or pausing to observe activities for a period of time so that as auditors we can be comfortable with what is going on. We may use static cameras, security cameras, CCTV, etc. And there's all sorts of remote imaging that's available nowadays, including using drones, etc. So that can help us in other ways to gain overviews of sites or conditions of areas, and allow us to perhaps get an overview very quickly. So again, it all depends on the technology that's available, but there's an awful lot of opportunity for us. And we can use remote methods for all different types of audits, whether it's looking at documentation or interviewing staff in a management systems audit, or looking at certain single issue audits around, say, energy consumption and management or waste, etc. Compliance auditing, again, certainly we can review documentation, monitoring records, etc. Compare the results against permit requirements. Due diligence, again, data rooms are very common for use in due diligence, that the auditor has remote access to a lot of documentation. And whether we use these internally or for supply chain auditing or external certification, registration, regulatory auditing, they can all be used in different ways. But again, I think some of the parties involved in these may have reservations, concerns about the reliability of the information. I mean, in due diligence, for example, when there's a lot riding on the outcome of an environmental audit, then there may be concerns that the remote methods don't give a clear enough picture of site conditions, and a site visit may be mandated. Similarly, for regulatory purposes, they just may not be permissible to use remote methods. But I think they can go a long way to fulfilling the requirements of different types of audit. Let's have a little look at some of the actual methods that can be used within the context of the overall environmental auditing process. So what I want to think about is what we actually are trying to achieve in an audit. Whether it's, I guess this is whether it's a traditional, standard site-based audit or a remote one. The same principles apply. I think that's really crucial to emphasize. So ISO 19001 defines an audit as being a systematic, independent and documented process for obtaining objective evidence and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent to which the audit criteria are fulfilled. So we're basically testing that we're doing what we say we're going to be doing. So obtaining evidence is the key to that. And that's what we need to satisfy ourselves about in remote auditing. Do the methods that we select actually allow us to collate the evidence that we want, and is the evidence reliable? So there are some potential implications for how we manage audits and overall audit programs as well. The program being the arrangements that we have for carrying out a set of audits, so that we can ensure that we utilize remote methods to obtain the evidence that we want to find. So this slide, I hope, sort of conveys what we're trying to do in the audit process. We start off with an audit that we have objectives or an objective for an audit. We can take a simple example. Let's say it's a waste management audit. We want to audit one of our sites to determine if they're following the company's waste management procedure. So our objective is, does the site actually follow the procedure? The scope is the waste management activities on that particular site. The criteria, well, because we're doing a waste management audit, the criteria will be all of the requirements within our company waste management procedure. And they could be all sorts of things like ensuring that we've got segregated waste bins available, making sure that staff are actually trained to use those properly, understand where the waste has to go, the procedures around waste documentation, shipment documentation, etc., etc. So those are the rules. And then we use various audit methods, as you would in a standard audit, to obtain evidence to see if those criteria are being fulfilled. So we'll observe, we'll go and look at the bins to make sure that they aren't contaminated. We'll perhaps discuss with staff to ensure that we recognise that, or we can confirm that they understand what bins they should be using. We'll go and review the waste documentation, etc. So we'll build up evidence, and we'll use the evidence to make our findings, which could be observations of good practice. It could be identifying that maybe things aren't being done quite as well as they could be. an opportunity for improvement, or maybe we find non-conformances that people don't know which bins to use, etc. And at the end of the audit, we'll come to our overall conclusion as to whether or not we think that site X is applying the company's waste management procedure properly. So that's the process that we go through, and we'll be using, like I say, a variety of methods to obtain the evidence that we need. So can we do that by using remote methods? Well, for this example, then certainly we can review documentation remotely. We can interview people remotely. If we have good communications mechanisms in place, then hopefully we can have an arrangement whereby one of the site staff takes us around with a camera and shows us the bins so we can see that they're not contaminated. And in that, we may even be able to conduct interviews on the factory floor, talking to people to make sure we know whether or not they understand how to deal with waste. So we may decide at the end of that the remote methods do give us enough information to be able to confirm that this particular site is following the procedure as it should be. If there are problems perhaps with some of the communications mechanisms, if we don't have reliable imaging, we aren't able to do a remote or virtual tour of the facility, then we may have a gap in our findings, and we may have to include in our audit reports the limitations in the audit. We were able to talk to people, we were able to look at documentation, and that gave us perhaps some comfort that they're following the procedure properly, but we felt that we would also want to be able to inspect the facility. So that could be a recommendation that a physical inspection is carried out as part of a subsequent audit. So we need to be sure that we identify any limitations using remote methods. So if we have an overall audit program, the program is the set of arrangements for carrying out audits. So we will have an audit program objective or objectives. This could be the overall objective is to ensure that the company has an effective environmental management system in place. We'll have a lot of different audit methods that are written up, perhaps in audit procedures that our auditors have to follow. We'll have various resources, which will include communications mechanisms. It'll include staff resourcing, as in having competent auditors, etc. And then we'll have a schedule of audits. So those little scrolls underneath are the individual audits that make up the overall schedule of audits. And we may decide that some of those we can carry out using remote methods. But we'll need to have all of the appropriate tools at our disposal to ensure that we're able to do that effectively. So within that schedule of audits, like I say, some may be entirely site-based, some may be entirely remote, and potentially some of them may involve using a combination of different methods, of remote and site-based. I think the important thing is to make sure that these methods are well understood, and that the audit program tools are communicated so that not just the auditors but auditees actually understand what's going to go on in an audit. Something else we need to consider is the implications of the potential limitations that we may have from using remote methods. And this is something that's strongly advised in ISO 19011, that when we're planning an audit, we consider the feasibility of achieving the audit objectives using the methods that we're planning to use. And if there's any doubt that we may not be able to use those effectively, then we may need to perhaps modify firstly the methods, or if we can't do that, then we may need to modify the objectives and the scopes so that we are actually able to achieve the objectives within a specific audit. And that can include revising the audit schedule so that we have perhaps follow-up site-based audits if remote ones aren't going to give us all the evidence that we need. I'd like to turn now to some of the challenges of using remote methods. So some general points. Firstly, the reliability of the communications media is really important. Do we have adequate bandwidth? Do we have access to all of the equipment that we need, whether it's portable laptops that people can take around, whether it's cameras, etc., etc. And obviously the competence of the auditor and the auditee to use this technology. And something I think is really helpful is if the audit program includes protocols for remote auditing. So some kind of documented protocol or procedure that explains to the auditor and the auditee exactly how to go about using these communications media to the best advantage. We need to think about confidentiality and security of information. So that may impose some limitations on using some of these remote methods, but that needs to be dealt with in the planning stage. And I think certainly for organizations that are just coming to grips with using remote methods, then timing, we need to be aware that it may take longer to complete some activities, partly because we're doing them in a different way, but also partly because people are not familiar with the approaches that we're going to be taking. And then in due course, as that familiarity develops, then hopefully we can become more efficient and effective. Also, using remote methods, whereas we're used to, with site-based methods, carrying out a specific audit in a discrete period of time, we go to site for a day or a few days, it may be we can spread out the audit over a longer timescale. So we can perhaps program in a few interviews at particular times to suit the auditees, so we make sure we get to see everyone that we want to do. We can arrange times to have access to documentation, potentially in a video conference format, so we can go through it with the environmental manager. So we may be able to be actually a little bit more efficient in how we use time. So let's look at some of the activities that we carry out. So firstly, reviewing documentation. Well, there's a lot of elements to consider here. There are a lot of different ways that we can do this. So documentation that's sent in advance of the audit. So we need to check that the data is complete. We make sure we have the right versions, etc. So that's a form of mitigation that we can carry out before the audit actually takes place, so that we assure that the documentation we're going to be reviewing is the right stuff. Having electronic access to data rooms or data systems, there may be problems where we can't find documentation on our own. So we shouldn't assume that it doesn't exist. We ought to ask for clarification or to be provided with what we think may be missing documentation. We may have technical problems. We may not have, or the access code that we've been given may not work. So it's helpful to make sure you've got a means of getting in touch with the IT department so that you can have support when you're working on the documentation. Sharing screens with the auditee, again, that can be very effective. Traditional, or very similar to a traditional audit, that you're going through the information with the auditee. But it can be difficult then to view hard copy documentation. Somebody may have to hold a manual up to a camera and try to show you the relevant pages. So again, if we can have hard copies scanned or sent in advance, that's always going to be useful. We might be able to use camera shots during a site tour, but that may not be, again, very easy to see. So again, we can ask for a copy to be sent electronically later, so that we can go through it when we have the time to do so. And potentially it gives us an opportunity to review a wider range of documentation than we might if we were on a hurried site visit. We can actually choose what it is that we want to see and make sure we see the most relevant material. I think it's really important to plan document review carefully. So make sure you understand what it is you think you want to see. Hopefully have a discussion up front with the auditee to confirm what kind of documentation is available, and that you will be able to see the relevant material. It can be time consuming. So again, when we're doing this as beginners, perhaps using remote methods, we need to allow ourselves a bit more time. Again, we do a lot of communication using media of different sorts. So hopefully this isn't as challenging as it might appear to be, but there are some things to bear in mind. That certainly if we're just using audio, we don't see the auditee, then we don't have any visual indicators. We're purely relying on voice, and we communicate an awful lot outside of what we actually say. So there are definitely some limitations built in. And it may be that we think that that's a technique that perhaps could best be used if the auditor and the auditee maybe know each other, have some sort of relationship, so there's some trust there, and you feel you can rely on what you're being told. Although I think there's a proviso there, as in any audit situation, auditors need to be objective and make sure you actually have faith in what it is that you are being told. Using any of the many different means of audiovisual communications, we can have problems with loss of connection. So I think in that situation, if we need to be able to agree a time to resume the interview. If it's just short-term disruption, then just for a minute or so, then you might, as an auditor, ask the auditee just to go over what it was he was saying when you had that blackout in communications, to make sure we don't lose anything. Potential interruptions. An auditee's on site in his office and somebody else comes in and demands his time. Well, we need to make sure that the auditee will have privacy and will be able to hopefully commit to that time to the audit. Possibly the auditee may be intimidated by the process in some situations. So again, it's helpful for the auditor to provide an explanation or a briefing in advance. Some companies I know use mentors so that the auditee isn't on their own. They have a colleague with them who can explain to them the audit process and exactly what it is that the auditor is trying to find out. And as always, the auditor should aim to reassure the auditee. Possibly problems with the auditor not being familiar with the technology, so we need to make sure that our auditors are properly trained. And we can use audio-visual communications with multiple parties to replicate meetings, which again can be very, very useful. But we need, as auditors, to make sure that we manage the meeting to give everybody a chance to participate and that we get the evidence from it that we actually want. Remote observation, using a portable camera or a mobile phone, so video streaming or possibly stills if we aren't able to get video. Various potential problems with that the auditee can select what they're actually showing you. So the auditor needs to direct the auditee, perhaps using a site plan to explain exactly where he wants the camera to go and what he wants to see. And the auditor also can take advantage of this by perhaps if you see a shot or just on the edge of the shot, you can ask the camera operator to change the view or to zoom in so that you actually, just as you would in a real situation, you'd be able to go and look at something in a bit more detail. You might be able to ask questions of staff if you have the right technology there during the site tour. But again, you need to have permission, and then the remote protocol must allow that. Possibly, as mentioned before, we can use the camera to look at documents. We may have poor bandwidth or resolution problems, so we do need to make sure that the equipment is suitable. And we may have to resort to recordings or stills that can be forwarded to us if there are any problems with communications. But also those can be useful because they give us, or we can use them to give us evidence of what's going on outside the audit slot. So we can look at stills that have been taken at different times to give us a longer sort of timeline, if you like, for the audit. I think I've mentioned static cameras providing limited views, so they may be helpful in some circumstances. And then we may be able to use other forms of aerial imagery. So an awful lot of potential for us, as long as we've got the right equipment and we have trained people to help us use it or to use it on our behalf. So we're gathering a lot of evidence. We need to verify that as auditors, just as you would in any form of audit. So in practice, there may be limitations, as we've just alluded to. So we've got to ensure that any indications or areas of uncertainty from one medium are backed up by evidence from others. So maybe if a video shot raises some concerns, then you clarify that through carrying out interviews or reviewing documentation. So we need to be able to develop audit trails, just as we would in a site-based audit, to verify that the evidence is valid. And this may take additional time. And again, it's something that auditors will become more familiar with as they carry out more remote audits. We've got to ensure that our findings, though, are based on reliable evidence. So if there are any limitations, we explain that in the audit report. And obviously, we do have to understand that in some situations, because the evidence isn't sufficiently robust, we can't fulfill all of the audit objectives. So I'll just move on then to considering the use of remote methods within an environmental audit program. We looked at a slide showing the different components of the program and how you can have different audits using different methods, etc. But I think these are some pointers that we shouldn't forget. So we need to make sure that we understand whether or not the program objectives and scope can be met. So this is the overall program, not just the individual audits, but are we able to schedule a mix perhaps of remote and site-based audits to give us the overall view that we need of our management system or whatever else it is that we are auditing. Audit program risks and opportunities. Well, these actually are terms taken from ISO 19011, and it deals with the risks. Obviously, we talked about the threats of not being able to achieve your objectives, but also potential opportunities for efficiencies as well. And that's something I think we really must consider. If we want to ensure that we're able to use remote audits and we have support for that, then it helps if we can show that there are some benefits and efficiencies. So we'll look at those in a moment. Having the appropriate resources available, people understanding their responsibilities and competencies as well, that's all part of it. And I think we've talked extensively about that, having the right sort of communications equipment, having trained auditors, having auditees understand the processes, etc., and being competent in using the remote methods. And how do we actually select the ones that we want to use within the audit program? And I think the key thing to me there is maybe allowing additional time, certainly in early stages, for auditing using remote methods. Then we can schedule the mix, as we've said before. But we also need to make sure that the results that we're getting from the audits are reliable and efficient, and whoever is responsible for managing the audit program should be doing that. I referred to audit protocols, some form of mechanism, some form of potentially a documented procedure or whatever that establishes the actual processes you're going to be using for applying the remote methods, whether it's for documentation review, whether it's for interviews or carrying out observation. So explaining the stages that you're going to be going through in gathering that evidence, and making sure that all parties involved have an understanding of what kind of systems you're going to be using, how to use them. Specific things like if an external auditor has been given documentation remotely, then what are the retention times and sort of deletion arrangements for that, for example, and all the confidentiality issues that go around it. Giving guidance for interviews, for the auditors in terms of how they should conduct themselves, for the interviewees in terms of what they should expect, and possibly the role of mentors in the interview process. And for observation, guidance for guides who are going to be taking the cameras around, potentially whether or not they can show documentation, whether or not they can engage with staff and perhaps ask staff if they are happy to be interviewed during that site tour, etc. And dealing with any access restrictions. So I think these can be very beneficial because they help the smooth flow of the audit and they can make the whole process much more efficient. Some points of good practice. Well, we need to adapt our audit processes, potentially to allow for more time, well, perhaps more so than potentially. I think in reality, allow more time for audit preparation and more communication in advance with the auditee, potentially providing checklists to the auditee before the audit and asking for exchange of documentation so that you have a better, you're on a better footing for planning the audit itself. And I think it's important that senior management are made aware of the role of remote audits and they are happy they should be used, and that they agree to allowing sufficient time available for the remote audit activities, including the planning, and they provide adequate technology. Also, they can support the auditor by making sure auditees understand the importance of collaborating in remote audits. And it's good if senior management appreciate the challenges and also the benefits of remote auditing. And I'll move on to the benefits now, so I think that's a really important point. We're far more likely to get senior management support for using audit methods remotely if they understand the benefits. So obviously it allows auditing to continue when access to sites is restricted, as in the current time. It reduces travel time and costs, which can be extensive, especially if we're talking about international auditing. It may allow a larger sample of remote locations to be audited. So if you have a multi-site organization, maybe with hundreds of different locations, you can sample a broader location through fairly rapid remote auditing. Maybe not full scope of a normal audit, but at least it allows you to gain a view of a wider number of sites. It can make it easier for auditors to sample outside of normal working hours. So if you want auditors to be able to have some information or talk to people who are carrying out night shift work, etc., then the remote auditing techniques could work well there. It obviously minimizes carbon footprints. So if organizations have greenhouse gas or carbon emissions reduction targets, then this can play an important part in that. It may allow us to bring in technical experts or specialists for brief periods of an audit or to address specific topics when it wouldn't be feasible for them to actually undertake a site visit. And it may reduce the risk to the auditee due to the presence of auditors on site, maybe in high risk circumstances, or perhaps in industries like the food sector where they don't want external parties bringing in any contaminants into the process. So they're quite a range, and I'm sure some of you will be able to think of a lot more. But I think again, it is important to try and emphasize the benefits, so that all those involved appreciate that this isn't just something that we're resorting to because we don't have any other alternative means of carrying out an audit. It actually can be effective and efficient. And those benefits won't just apply in the current situation, but also in the longer term. And I think also, obviously, it's very important now that it does allow us to keep on auditing. So I'll close now. I hope that's been useful. I'd like to wish you luck in your remote auditing, and I hope you have success in applying these methods. And I'd be very interested in hearing about your experience of using remote auditing. So if you're happy to, I'd be delighted if you wanted to contact me, share those experiences using LinkedIn. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Nigel Lehane, for that look at environmental management system auditing using remote methods. That concludes this presentation.